So it seemed that one common theme that came up throughout these talks was the concept of risk, both how plasticity can help you modulate risk and also how it might result in risk in terms of whether you're able to match a potential new environment. And I'm wondering if you could comment from your different perspectives on whether there might be some common themes or rules or theories that we could use to understand how an organism's evolutionary past and biology might constrain that risk.
I'll start, sure. I'll give it my best shot. Okay, so I come from a hardcore sort of developmental genetic background, and so I don't think about these questions in the same way that the others on the panel do. But one thing that has come to my attention during my studies is that it seems to be the case that organismal systems are inherently fairly robust. When you expose an organism to a stressor, whether this be for instance, fluctuating temperature conditions or the absence of microbiota, developmental systems, although they may not perform optimally, they don't seem to just fall apart. Right? Your organism doesn't just die. So I think from my perspective, what I'm really interested in is understanding how it is that developmental systems are able to maintain this robustness. And on the one hand, I think this may be underlain by plasticity. And so one of the things that there's often this distinction made between robustness and plasticity in development and evolution, but really they're just the same coin, just different sides. In order to maintain a robust response, you must have plasticity and gene expression that underlies that response, and vice versa. So I'm very curious about this, how organisms maintain those plastic repertoires that allow them to maintain robust phenotypes, as well as the ways in which developmental systems can respond and integrate adaptive responses to novel environments. And I think the theory of facilitated variation, for those who are curious about this, provides a good amount of answers in that regard.
And I would add, overall, I would say that, what we see over and over in theoretical work is you want to minimize risk in a way. You want to minimize between generation fluctuations in fitness. And so in order to accomplish that, sometimes you need to increase variation within a generation to minimize between generation variation in fitness. And you can do that through a wide variety of strategies, from this type of stochastic change that I mentioned to some organisms employ more sensing type of strategies, and so on. And for a lot of these things, what we see repeatedly, I think, are strategies that may not confer a benefit to any one individual in particular, but overall, they are helpful for the lineage.
So I work on extinct organisms, and I think a lot about the patterns that we see over time where you have high rates of speciation in some lineages, and they tend to be the ones that go extinct. And then you have these other lineages that don't seem to do very much, but they stick around for a long time. And I'm wondering if the rates of plasticity could be applied to that level of thinking. Is there something, so are your organisms that have more plasticity in more traits more likely to be those lineages that stay alive through evolutionary time? Do you have a sense of how much plasticity varies across species and across big groups of species? Does that make sense?
Well, so we in terms of aphids, think about our post-plant adapted biotypes, depending on your opinions on sympatric speciation, as kind of undergoing a process of speciation. And so we were excited that they were that variable in terms of their plastic response, just because it gave us kind of an opportunity to see how plasticity might be facilitating kind of the adaptation of those groups to their new environments. And I don't have an answer for you yet, but that's certainly something that we're interested in thinking about in terms of, if these species are in fact undergoing a process of speciation, does wing plasticity play a role in that? But I mean, we're only looking at one trait, so maybe you all that study many more plastic traits together could comment.
I would just quickly add that, I would look, if I were you, I would sort of try to look. Some people have tried to link plasticity to generalists versus specialists. So I would sort of look at that literature of trying to understand when would you want to evolve a generalist phenotype versus more of these types of specialists that only do well in certain environments and would perish otherwise.
I have two questions about the guppy study we're talking about. The first question, you showed that when in the low predation condition, they have lower the growth rate. Why is that so?
So the question is, why do low predation guppies have slower growth?
Yeah.
I think it's just part of the general sort of life history syndrome that in high predation environments with high mortality, you have a much more of a sort of a live fast, die young kind of strategy where you grow very quickly, you mature at a small age and size, and you start to reproduce before you get eaten. In the low predation environments, it's a more competitive environment, and so maturing at a very small, growing fast and maturing at a small size is actually disadvantageous. You're at a disadvantage, and it's better to delay maturity, grow more slowly, and be a sort of a more robust individual in order to sort of maintain your competitiveness within that high density environment. Does that make sense?
But so if they mature later, would the fitness be lower, or if you compare two genotypes in the low predation environment?
Yeah, so that's sort of it's kind of a different question than what I was interested in. But yes, on one hand, you could ask, another way of saying that is, why do you see the evolution of a low predation life history? Because maturing earlier should always, and reproducing earlier should always be, have a fitness advantage. But actually, that turns out not to be the case under high density. And under high density conditions, maturing early actually puts you at a fitness disadvantage. And there's work by Ron Basser, who's done a series of mesocosm type experiments that show that effect very clearly.
Because the fecundity is lower if you mature early, or?
Because basically, if you mature early, you're very small, and you basically get outcompeted by larger individuals. And so you don't get as much food, you have lower fecundity, you have lower survival.
Okay, so the second question I have is your interpretation of the relationship between plasticity and adaptation. You were saying the plasticity kind of strengthened it because it's in the opposite direction of adaptation. It strengthened the selection.
Strengthening selection, yes.
So in a way, so I don't know whether you're thinking that in order to strengthen the selection, the plasticity goes the opposite direction, or it's just a natural consequence. The strengthening of selection is just a natural consequence of the opposite direction of plasticity.
I'm not sure I'm following your question. So is it that
because okay, so if the adaptation is to go higher, for example, in expression, and the plasticity for whatever reason it happens to go the low expression, then of course the natural consequence is selection is stronger. Are you saying that?
Yes.
Okay, because the other possibility is that there is a purpose for making the selection stronger, and for that purpose, the plasticity goes to the low end. You're not saying the second one.
Yeah, well, I think I lean towards the first interpretation just because I guess my thinking is that if you move into an environment where there's never been an opportunity for selection to act, by chance, some traits may go in the right direction, but many will go in the wrong direction, let's say. And so that's where the opportunity for selection to sort of shape the patterns of plasticity come from. And so I don't know that there would be any reason to sort of, unless there was some history of sort of phenotypic memory or history of plasticity with and without predators, that these populations would be just pre-adapted to show an adaptive response. So I think that you're just seeing variation. Most of it is in the wrong direction, and that's what selection acts most strongly on initially.
Okay.
Just in response to that, I would say that maybe you may suggest another possibility this morning in talking about the difference between sort of a gene being maladapted plastically, which is I think what the situation you're describing, and sort of the possibility that given that you're not well adapted to the current condition, sort of invoking some kind of a stress response. So
So that's certainly I think a possibility. Yeah, I guess I should. But I think the question is, what are the consequences for the strength of selection then? Because we're also seeing the evolution of reduced plasticity in those same transcripts over time. So if they were conferring some sort of best of a bad situation, why wouldn't they be retained? And why is that the magnitude of plasticity decreasing? It suggests that plasticity itself is also under selection. But again, when you're dealing with these kinds of data and you're very far away from knowing the exact pathways that they're involved in and the traits that they're influencing, I think it is a little bit open to speculation.
First, I'd like to express my appreciation for everybody on the panel for a very edifying day today. This question might or might not be related to phenotypic plasticity, and I want to specifically address the question to Dr. Kaja. If I understand that cancer cells basically come from the host own cells with uncontrolled growth, what exactly is the evolutionary benefit of the cancer cells and to whom?
I think sort of turning the question back a little bit, maybe you can ask the question, why isn't there, for example, let's take something like breast cancer, right? Why don't we see selection against it? If it kills people, why don't we see selection against it? Well, the reason why we don't see selection against it is because oftentimes, if you look at incidence rates of cancer, oftentimes they happen post-reproduction. And so we don't see selection against it is because it kills people after they reproduced. And so they were able to sort of pass their genes to their offspring. And so that's one of the reasons why, we can't say there's selection against tumors. And the reason, tumors are essentially, the way I view them, I mean, I'm sure a cancer biologist would be much better equipped to answer this question, but the way I view them is, a series of mistakes that happen, a series of steps that happen in a cell, and one of them, enough accumulation of these mistakes sometimes gives a certain cell an evolutionary benefit. And really, if you wait long enough, and if you try to sort of map some probability of getting one of these cells as you age, as individuals age, and look at incidence rates, the probability goes to 1 as we increase sort of the age of the individual. So if we were to live longer, X number of hundreds of years, we would all end up getting cancer. But it's not selected against in the population because we're most often able to reproduce before it, and so it isn't actively selected against.
This may be a silly question, but bear with me. Much of the focus has been on individual species and developmental robustness and plasticity and everything else. But in biology, we have species interact, form natural communities, and we have emergent properties. And if we look around and we ask ourselves, what's the biological equivalent of cancer? So it's essentially environmental degradation. And we could take an example like the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, where global warming is threatening its very existence. Are there any principles you can take either from theory or from practice from your individual case studies that you can scale them up to ecosystems and could look at those phenomena in terms of plasticity and robustness of biological communities over the next, say, 100 years?
I've thought a little bit about this in terms of emergent properties of social groups, so we have honeybees living in a colony and they're sort of behaving together. And I didn't talk about this work, but one kind of interesting thing I found recently is you can have differences in tendency of behavior, but that can be masked depending on environmental context. And so depending on, you can take two sets of honeybees with very different histories up until a certain point in time and then combine them together. And depending on that group composition, you may see different behaviors expressed depending on that sort of current social group. So I think one idea may be sort of some levels of cryptic variation or cryptic plasticity across species that you may not recognize until you see something like maybe environmental degradation that changes some of the fundamental makeup of that community. That would be, I think, kind of maybe an interesting parallel.
So I think, I think it's a very interesting question in terms of scaling up the plastic responses of individual players within a community up to levels of ecosystems. And it's not something that really has been, I think, given a lot of attention, but I think there's increasingly different groups that are kind of looking at, for example, ecosystem effects of like different genotypes or the plastic responses in terms of, say, like nitrogen excretion and how that plays a role. So like with the guppies, we know that there's a whole other separate group that is looking at the sort of ecosystem consequences of these introductions. So as the guppies are evolving, they're excreting nitrogen, they're consuming the invertebrates, but they're actually increasing the primary production within these streams. And so they have a fertilizing effect, so to speak. And so there's actually a significant measurable ecosystem effect, but that also changes as they evolve and adapt. And so part of like becoming a locally adapted, low predation guppy is intimately related to those sort of ecosystem functions that they also play. And so, as whole ecosystems experience stress and are subject to sort of strong selection, the question, I think, is, do the populations evolve in such a way that will make them more resilient to those kinds of changes, or are we looking at some sort of non-analog community in the future that is very different from what we have today?
All right, I hope you all join me in thanking our speakers and our panel.